Thank you very much. Firstly, I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered. And I'd like to also thank Lisa and Annette for a great program today. It's really fantastic to hear these very different disciplinary perspectives on sport. And the perspective that we're going to bring today, and I should also introduce my research assistant, Cindy Minarova-Banjak, who's been doing a little bit of work behind the scenes, and I'll be turning to her to talk a little bit about the literature in this space as well in a second. But we're bringing a diplomatic perspective to today's discussion. And already, just listening from the presentations earlier, there are so many areas of overlap and dovetail in the kinds of themes that we're talking about. I'd like to give a bit of a shout out to Aaron Alsop from the PNG Sports Foundation and Craig Rousel from Gold Coast City Council, who have both been really supportive in helping us recast diplomacy and the way that we think about diplomacy through the lens of sport, and also through the lens of the city and the way that cities are building relationships with nation states. So we'll be continuing this relationship. It's a really important one. In early 2015, the Gold Coast City Council Mayor Tom Tate actually signed a memorandum of understanding with Papua New Guinea's Minister for Sport. And that memorandum, the purpose of it was to really commit the city, the regional city of the Gold Coast and its northern neighbour nation state, Papua New Guinea, to building closer sporting ties with each other. It was about partnership through sport. Signing that MOU was an act of diplomacy in and of itself. It signalled the Gold Coast's intention to really leverage its role as the host of the 2018 Commonwealth Games in building better relationships with nations in this region. It was a flagship initiative, and one of the first activities that was to flow from this initiative was actually a leadership summit, bringing close to 30 athletes and coaches from PNG to spend 6 days in the Gold Coast to develop their own leadership capacity, to build their teamwork skills, and to think about their roles as representatives of the PNG through sport. So the relationship thus far bears all the hallmarks of sports diplomacy. It's a new field in diplomacy which is traditionally conducted by nation states through their officials, often in the hallways of embassies or overseas missions or multilateral institutions. In fact, it's much more reminiscent of public diplomacy that Gareth Evans, a former Foreign Minister of Australia, talked about as casting the net wide to engage not just the informed few, but the uninformed many in the dialogue of nations. Quick shout out, Clint, too. I'd like to mention Runaway Bay Sports Super Centre as being very important in this study. I just saw you there. So we're in a new space of public diplomacy through sport. It's about connecting people and institutions, building capacity in the region, and promoting Australia's reputation and influence. But the evidence that supports sports diplomacy is notoriously thin. Questions about the nature and conduct of this very less conventional mode of diplomacy must be asked. Whose interests are being advanced, by whom, and for what ends, in particular when they're connected to foreign policy goals? So to address these questions, we're going to be reviewing the emerging and relevant literature in the space and take a closer look at how sport is driving this relationship between the Gold Coast and PNG. And it does have implications for cities and the role of cities more broadly. But first, it's worth canvassing the broader diplomatic context within which this particular relationship sits. And that is the relationship between Australia, and if any of you have been to the exhibition that's on at the moment at the Queensland Gallery, which is an exhibition about Australia's #1 neighbour, the PNG, you'll realise that this is an uneasy and troubled and difficult relationship. Building and sustaining this relationship in diplomatic terms is essential to Australia's security, as well as to Australia's economic and political engagement in the region today. From a security perspective, it was Paul Dibb in 1986 who talked about the arc of instability that really began from Papua New Guinea and stretched around into the Pacific as framing Australia's security concerns going forward. It was an area from or through which a military threat to Australia could most easily be posed. More recently, even though we've seen that language, the arc of instability, fade somewhat, as focus moves towards transnational organised crime links, to development concerns, to criminality and corruption in the region, we see the phraseology trouble in paradise as reflecting sort of Australia's concerns about the region within which it sits. But it's also a gateway of opportunity. Our Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, has reframed Australia's geostrategic perspective to be that of the Indo-Pacific, the Indian Ocean, Asia-Pacific region. Papua New Guinea is absolutely critical in that space. Not only is Papua New Guinea seen as a leader in the Pacific, hosting APEC next year, it's a gateway into Southeast Asia as well. So Papua New Guinea has become a linchpin of sorts in Australia's own engagement within its own neighbourhood. In economic terms, PNG is a major destination for Australian investment, close to $20 billion per year, most of it going towards the mining sector. And Australia remains PNG's largest trading nation. Of course, though, the relationship is dominated by development, by an aid and development assistance relationship. Australian aid to PNG has totalled nearly $15 billion over the last few decades, incorporating a range of programs, leadership and capacity building programs aimed to strengthen the public sector and to develop governance and deliver essential services into PNG. But it has and continues to be a very complex and difficult relationship, characterised by historic colonial ties, rooted in notions of racial and cultural superiority, and exacerbated by what some call Australia's hasty and ill-timed retreat in 1975. It's characterised by asymmetries in power and interests, and a tendency, particularly seen from PNG towards Australia, to interfere and exploit. As Lowy Institute's Sean Dorney recently reported in his new book, The Embarrassed Colonialist, while pretending not to have been a colonial power, Australia's control over Papua New Guinea's political, economic and social advancement through aid is in some cases still understood to be an example of colonial administration or paternalistic neo-colonialism under the guise of mutual benefits. At the same time, linkages between people, linkages between the two nations at a people-to-people level remain fairly thin. Many commentators have noticed that very few Australians really have any knowledge about PNG. Ignorance and lack of understanding have reinforced perceptions of Papua New Guinea as Australia's last unknown, where media reports often mythologise Melanesian sports representatives, and racial stereotypes make engagement all that more difficult. With sensitivities around the Moti affair, Bougainville, Manus Island, and the recent ban on Australian imports, it would seem that Australian diplomats do have a bit to worry about. The diplomacy, of course, continues through official channels, but it's really interesting that it was only in 2013 that the two Prime Ministers, then Tony Abbott for us, Peter O'Neill on the Papua New Guinea side, agreed to annual leaders' meetings. So that's characteristic of this very rigid relationship that exists. And this potentially is where sport takes its cue, as an informal yet quite critical dimension of Australia's relationship with this northern neighbour. It engages beyond official channels. It promotes levels of understanding and relationship building, all of which might contribute or at least pave the way for Australia's broader diplomatic relationship. You may know the Australian government, being very aware of the importance of sport more generally, launched its sports diplomacy strategy in 2015, a 3-year strategy that is intended to inform its diplomatic relations in the region. Of course, this isn't a new thing, and sport has long been associated with Australia's relationship in the region. But it's been a fairly tricky space, more framed in the development space, development outcomes, than it has been for diplomacy. And at this point, in terms of casting sport as a vehicle for diplomacy, I will turn to Cindy, who's waited really patiently, to talk a little bit about the literature and some of the tensions that sit within that literature in the way that we've shifted our notion of sport as a vehicle from development to one for diplomacy. Take it away.
Okay. So when looking at the literature, the story of sports diplomacy has been frequently described in a number of books and journal articles, and it all relatively says the same thing. That is that the application of sports to foreign affairs is hardly new. We can trace it back to the original Olympic Games, to states such as Nazi Germany, or even to contentious periods in history like the Cold War. But prior to 2013, diplomacy in international sport has been relatively under-theorized and under-explained. And for scholars and academics in this field, that's been the biggest challenge. And particularly because by being overlooked in academic disciplines, sports diplomacy has lacked this theoretical inquiry, the empirical data to support claims, resulting in a large gap or deficiency. And so in that sense, looking at the beginnings of sports diplomacy really occurred when a diplomacy and international sports research group was set up in 2011 in the UK. And from this period, within 2 years, a noticeable increase in attention to sports diplomacy has occurred. Very much so that for Barry Sanders, one of a key scholar in the field, stated that the recent renaissance in sports diplomacy has been crucial to recognizing that beyond sport as simply a form of physical activity, sport. And we need to recognize the fact that sport has become a gigantic and powerful medium for the international spread of information, reputations, but also relationships. As well as being a tool that governments use to achieve foreign policy objectives, the power of sport, and that's a key phrase that we have to use, the power of sport, has meant that sports has become both a mediator, a collaborator, and while on the other hand, in some cases, a separator as well of peoples, communities, and countries. So this theoretical shift to sport as a means of international diplomacy really, as Caitlyn has said, sits alongside this rapidly expanding field of public diplomacy. That is diplomatic engagement with people rather than simply being state to state. Diplomacy scholars such as Pigman and Rolfe note that one of the main rationales for investigating sports diplomacy has been soft power, or the power to attract and persuade, as place branding and the cultivation of public opinion by governments in countries has increasingly gained traction. In that sense, as sport has come to represent an ideal channel that nations, regions, and now increasingly cities use to share their identities. It really follows that international sport and its millions of followers, people who watch sport, people who engage in sport, really come into this subtext of public diplomacy itself. For Australia, a nation that has typically found public diplomacy hard work, this is significantly important, particularly because, according to our former chief diplomat, Peter Varghese, we struggle to find, and throughout history we have struggled to find, symbols of our uniqueness because of our location, because our location means only a limited number of people actually have direct contact with Australia. Going back to the notion that we are isolated and separated from the old world Europe, as it was referred to before. In Varghese's view, direct exposure to the country and its people is Australia's greatest public diplomacy asset, where sport is an excellent vehicle for providing that direct exposure. In that sense, the multidimensional ways of communicating, representing, and negotiating between a plethora of diplomatic actors has really led to this direct participation of foreign publics in international affairs, all for the goal of advancing Australia's national interest. However, despite the recent renaissance of sport diplomacy studies, the meaning of sport diplomacy itself remains tricky. In their paper, Mapping the Relationship Between International Sport and Diplomacy, Murray and Pigman described the term as a theoretical and practical hybrid of two significant institutions, with two distinct categories. So the first category is really the intentional use of sport as an instrument of diplomacy by states. This is really a state-centric approach where governments are the main actors and representatives who engage and who directly approach each other through sport as the medium. The second category is looking at international sport as diplomacy. That is a multi-stakeholder situation where traditional diplomats work alongside city actors, multinational corporations, intergovernmental organizations, celebrities, and sports people, as a way of understanding behavior, culture, and attitudes, managing and building relationships, and influencing opinions and actions. Sport diplomacy, from this definition, becomes an alternative means of engagement, rather than simply expressing a government's diplomatic and foreign policy goals. It's no longer that state-centric, top-down approach, but rather it's gone outwards in terms of who the state interacts with and how it engages with others. In the Australian context, the emphasis has shifted away from its former development focus to become an important face of Australia's public diplomacy efforts. So that includes facilitating the communication of public diplomacy messages in a subtle and less overtly political way. Really, that's the emphasis of the second category. The sports diplomacy strategy that was released in 2015 highlights 4 distinct goals of sports diplomacy. For Australia, this includes connecting people and institutions, promoting development capacity with a focus on young people, women and girls, showcasing Australia's credentials and capabilities, particularly in sports delivery and management, and supporting innovation and integrity. This strategy for Australia particularly has been a unique opportunity, noting that sport has been leveraged by governments for millennia. Stuart Murray, who was also part of our faculty, he argues that Australia is right to develop its unique sporting asset for diplomatic leverage. It is, as he notes, deeply embedded within both the psyche and cultural fabric of the nation. While the Australian strategy was conceived at the national level, it is also worth noting that cities have an interest in sport as they develop and expand their own diplomatic aspirations. The literature, in fact, looking at cities has also only recently increased. Indeed, cities are now more frequently recognized as important global actors that actually draw on public diplomacy. They in using sport to carve out their identity, their relationships, but also their political relevance in a more globalized world. Hosting major international events holds particular appeal for some cities, including generating and accentuating the city's global visibility and soft power that is being concentrated over a period of time. The expectation is that there will be a difference before hosting an international event compared to after, where the attractiveness, the influence, and the recognition of cities will have increased after the sporting event. Hosting an event of mega proportions like the Olympic Games is typically reserved for what we call truly global cities, those cities that are internationally recognized and that do have that are recognized all over the world by nearly all citizens. And this means And by calling them global cities, what it means is that we recognize them as also having capacity, infrastructure, and manpower to actually hold these events, capability in that respect. Yet, the second-order Commonwealth Games offers the hosting opportunity to second-tier regional or developing cities within the Commonwealth. As such, it holds the potential for global reach and visibility to cities that haven't got to that global city level yet. Really, it's pursued by these cities that seek to engage within this wider international audience in order to form these deeper relationships which really lie at the heart of business and political success in the global economy. And as the city emerges as a new actor in this complex field of sports diplomacy, narrowing this down, the interaction between the Gold Coast in Australia PNG sports diplomacy comes to the fore. By expanding the conceptual framework of sports diplomacy to include the city, which views sport really as a promotional dream linking city, country, idealism and enterprise all into one, this paper and really perhaps this a wider study in evaluating sports diplomacy seeks to add to the widening interest in sports diplomacy, providing practical solutions on the policies that can be implemented at cities and national levels to support this emerging strategy.
So, to now get back to our case study, thank you so much, Cindy, of Spots. And talking about the MOU that was signed between the city of the Gold Coast and Papua New Guinea, it's worth actually digging into it a little bit more to see how and where it actually ticks some of the boxes of what Australia calls sports diplomacy. The MOU itself was not signed on a whim. It reflects an evolving sporting relationship between the two players. In fact, before it was signed, some 18, I think, sporting camps had been held on the Gold Coast, 15 of those at the Runaway Bay Super Sports Centre. So there was an existing relationship in place. But in signing it, the interests that came to the fore from each of the parties represented a slight divergence in what they were hoping to achieve, or what they hoped to achieve going forward. Of course, connecting people and institutions has been really critical. Tom Tate, the mayor, noted with so many countries coming to our part of the world to take part in the 2018 Commonwealth Games, forging great partnerships with these visitors is essential. And indeed, the opportunity for connections beyond the city and the state have really grown. They include JCU University, Griffith University, we hope Bond University, as well as a number of sporting institutions as well. Enhancing sport for development appears to be a central part of this MOU. Again, Mayor Tom Tate noting, we will provide mentoring opportunities to PNG sporting representatives, will facilitate introductions with local sporting organisations, community groups and extend the relationship of the city. The leadership summit that kicked off the MOU was particularly critical in this space. And from the PNG side, it's really been noted that this is about developing the leadership skills of individuals, the individual athletes and the coaches, but it's also about starting to change the mindset of communities and build the reputation of the country. So development sits very much at the centre. But probably what comes to the fore more on the Gold Coast side, quite naturally too, given that any diplomatic measure is going to have a sense of promoting the policy of the place, is how this MOU might actually promote and maximise economic development. With over 20 different PNG national sports training in southeast Queensland, this has really been seen as an opportunity to bring dollars to the regions. Tom Tate reaffirms sporting teams and their support crews visiting the Gold Coast for extended periods of training means that their dollars will be spent with accommodation providers, restaurateurs and other local businesses. Across all of these areas, this particular MOU at the city level actually does tick a lot of the boxes that Australia put together in developing its sports diplomacy strategy. But I'll finish with just highlighting a couple of the challenges, because it's not without its problems. Those, I would say, are threefold. Firstly, the issue of hospitality and building relationships as opposed to a transactional process is quite critical. Secondly, a divergence of interests and trying to build on commonalities of interests and mutuality in those interests is critical. And finally, a lack of evaluation, something that's come up quite considerably throughout today. In terms of hospitality and relationships, it is really worth noting that the connections made between people and institutions do appear impressive, but do they stack up and just how deeply do they run? Anecdotally, we know that the participants from PNG who actually engaged in the Leadership Summit got quite a bit out of it. But we need to do a great deal more to actually understand what the community impact is long term, particularly in a country as diverse as PNG. From a Gold Coast perspective, there's a real opportunity to provide tangible hospitality, to understand cultural sensitivities and overcome cultural gaps. And certainly in terms of overcoming a divergence of interest, building on the relationship, people to people, community to community, institution to institution, helps the Gold Coast to overcome a perceived sense of transaction in its approach to the PNG and to really develop a relationship that actually can become part of the broader diplomatic fabric between Australia and PNG. So where does this leave us? The MOU linking the Gold Coast and PNG is certainly not going to take the diplomatic relationship to new levels too quickly, but it will make a difference over time. This is an important symbolic move by the Gold Coast City Council. It is a flagship initiative and it does underpin Australia's broader commitment to expanding its relationships with other nations. If we can ensure that this agreement is characterised by generous hospitality, building on a commonality of interests that are not just drilled down to transactions and dollar values, and that can be sustained over the long term, this particular initiative is likely to build not just on its symbolism and style, but also some substance into the diplomatic relationship. Thank you.
Thanks, mate. I'm trying to think how to phrase this. I have a question floating around in my head, but where would you say, like these programs for, you know, there's a whole movement across the world in sport for development and peace. Where would you say development and diplomacy ends and colonialism begins? Because, you know, we're very different culturally to our Indo-Pacific neighbours. So when nations are coming here, such as Papua New Guinea for leadership forums and so on, who are we to tell them how to be leaders? And, you know, culturally we're incredibly different. So, you know, where does development end and colonialism begin is, I guess, is my question.
I think that's a really tricky part of the landscape, and I don't know that there's any nice, neat answer to give to you in that space, except that in diplomacy, where you can find mutual outcomes, some reciprocity, and you know, partners come to a table on an equal basis. That's actually where you start to build on what is, you know, the foundation of public diplomacy is really about trying to get to that mutuality, reciprocity, recognising that there is difference and that both parties can actually share in this relationship. So from an Australian perspective, what can we learn from the Papua New Guinea participants who come to the leadership? Because I think you're right, it isn't and it shouldn't be about Australia saying, here's how you do it. It's really about, you know, we're actually both partners in an Indo-Pacific region. How can we learn from the PNG experience? how can we learn what that experience is, better understand it, and work in a partnership situation? And sport is a really nice equaliser because we see participants from PNG doing really well in Australian competitive environments, and so that's where, you know, paving the way for those official diplomatic dialogues, sport can be really positive.
Can I just?
Lottie, sorry.
I'll just add to that because I actually set that up. The specific question around like the leadership stuff, for example, you could talk about this for hours. I could sit with everyone here and tell you the full story, but just even things like visas getting here, you know, it's just ridiculous. So I'm an Aussie, but I lived up there. I went there as a volunteer for 12 weeks, and then they ended up giving me a job as a high performance manager and haven't left. So I've been there nearly 4 years as of next month. But specifically to this question, the stuff around the leadership camp, you're right. Australians, as an Aussie, I can say this too, so don't be offended, but we can't keep going to these countries saying that we actually know how to do it. It's pretty arrogant, and colonialism will straight away shut the door. I went there as a volunteer and I lived in a village for 11 and a half weeks. So that is what everyone knows me as, is the volleyball guy from Bubakori, not the high performance manager that won them all the gold medals at the Pacific Games. So if you go there with that arrogance of, we actually have the answers, you won't last. Specifically, Clint's in the front row here, who the amount of dialogue that we had to have face-to-face, hundreds of emails about the curriculum for that leadership camp was because we kept telling the people that were running the stuff, and Clint was the best out of everybody that was used that week, that no, that's wrong, don't do that. If you do a lecture for more than 15 minutes, they'll switch off. It's got to be workshop-based activities, get them into their cultural setting, which is sitting on the floor, in groups, doing activities, come back, share their opinion. All that stuff, we had to break down those barriers before we even come. So, yeah, I'm not interested in a technical expert talking about the latest sports science techniques because I don't care, because we can't implement it back home with no technology, no internet, no power. So, awesome. You got the science behind it? I really don't care. I want to know what we want that's going to make an impact in our environment. So if it's not sustainable, consistent, repeatable, keep your theories to yourself, please.
Actually, and Aaron, just to build on that as well, and I think Clint, you might have some thoughts on this. One of the other things is, you know, really thinking through the cultural gap that exists between participants, and you know, cultural references being appropriate and understood is really important. Knowing food, you know, how to deliver the right food, how to demonstrate that you understand the cultural environment that people come from and learn from it is really important.